Right, I just taught a few words about entire lecture actually about an hour long, about the War of the Spanish Succession in Polish, of course, in my native tongue. Because I started with Polish version because it's for me the easiest to collect my thoughts, and now I can do the English version and maybe even German version afterwards. But of course, I must notice at the note at the beginning that for an average English person interested in history, the War of Spanish Succession is far better known than for a Polish person, because in on Polish land, in Poland, we are engaged involuntarily in the same time when the War of the Spanish Succession was fought in from 1701 to 1714. We are engaged in involuntarily in the Great Northern War with the combatants like Sweden against the Russians, the Danes, and the Saxons. In the same time, Poland was fighting its own sub-war to some extent, we could say that, and it's very similar to a Spanish role in the War of the Spanish Succession, so to speak, because it's also fighting a civil war in the same time. So when the general war is fought. Okay, so at the beginning, we have some idea that if France wants to dominate Europe, it must win against everybody, because in the name of the équilibre, the balance of power, so to speak, that this term was coined. Sorry, English listeners, it was coined in France, not in England. It was only used by Henry VIII to point out that England could be the deciding factor when the two giants are fighting against each other, that is, the Austrians and the French, then the English can provide some sort of a decisive power, small power. Okay, deciding factor. But the whole idea of the equilibrium was known before. But nevertheless, it was understood and perfectly well, it was obvious for everybody that if France wanted to dominate Europe, it would have to fight against practically everybody, every Western European state, because France was like the United States of that era. It was so powerful, so much more powerful than every other nation. So the standing army was of astonishing size, like 250,000 soldiers, whereas the Dutch had at their disposal, it was the strongest allied army, in the anti-French coalition. The strongest army was the Dutch army, actually, the Staatsleger. It was about maybe 120,000 men strong at the beginning, and then afterwards we could count the Imperial Army, the Austrian Army, a little bit smaller, and the combined of different forces, sometimes of hired German mercenaries and so on and so on, the combined colorful British Army. Okay, so these three armies were together a little bit stronger than French army, but only a little bit. So you see that France was like United States when compared to particular European states today. We could use this relation to depict how big the difference of potential was. So it was understandable that France will maybe try again against all the others to fight through and for the domination. And in already France already tried that in 1660s and failed. It was the war because of the reunion policy. And then in the 1690s, among others, some other skirmishes and so on, and the other war was fought in 1690s, and Louis XIV, the King of France, have postponed the general show for some other years. And when everybody knew that in Spain there was a sickly king, Carlos the second, who had many illnesses, many problems, health problems, and it was expected that he will die any day soon. And what was supposed to happen after that? Well, the European powers and the Dutch and the English are pretty much acting in this as one power, because they shared a common king, William of Orange, as William III in England, the same, and married to Mary Stuart. The English were acting like one power, and the Austrians as the strongest ally. And it was they met with the French, and the French have promised that they will agree to put on the Spanish throne after the soon death of Carlos II. They will put as a boy who was from the Wittelsbach family, that is the reigning house of Bavaria. Bavaria was a little bit of a middle ground, because Bavaria was almost always very pro-French, but it was also in the proximity of Austria and the main body of Austria, so they had to be cautious. So the Bavarians were a good choice to satisfy everybody. But this small boy from Bavaria died very soon. So after all those conferences. So it was expected that the French king will, because the French had a very strong succession rights, because several queens of Spain were from the Valois Bourbon house, and it was expected that the French will try to put some of the French princes there. And so it was okayed by the other courts, provided that the French will put some very strong stress on that the French and the Spanish potential should never be connected in one. So it was expected that the Spanish Empire will be divided, and all its European possessions, except the Spain itself, will go. That is Belgium, the Spanish Netherlands, Belgium. It was known as the Spanish Netherlands back then, and some northern Italian with the crown, with the main crown of Milano, Mailand in German. Belgium and Milan were supposed to be given to the Habsburgs, to the Viennese Habsburg, to Vienna, to the Austrians. Whereas the American Empire, Spanish Empire, and the Spain itself would come to the Bourbons, but only if France will not try to make it one country. Although they were practically already thinking that the French would try that, because this whole dividing of the empire was practically based on the idea that the French would try exactly that. So it was like believe, but also check. Yeah. Okay. So believe, but also call the cards. Okay. So what the Louis did was that he decided that he will openly present the situation in such a way that he would like to make Spain practically part of French Empire, or something like this, like two crowns put together and cooperating together. And he also claimed all lands that were controlled, all countries that were controlled by Madrid. So long. The Spain itself, as the military potential, was rather small, because after 1660s, the court of Madrid has very very significant economical problems with budget, and they were close to bankruptcy. They even declared bankruptcy once, but that's not important. But they were not a very a very important factor to play on the side of the French. So the French had practically to do everything themselves. They could only count more or less on the support of the Spanish people, and if they will equip some Spaniards also, yes, maybe, but they did it, and to some extent it worked, but only to some extent. So basically, it was French armies against Allied armies, and we had three theaters of war, and one was, of course, Spain as a sub-war or civil war, which was a sub-war to the the War of Spanish Succession. But the main theater was the other secondary theater was Italy, of course, Milan as the claimed territory by both sides, but also Genoa, and Genova in Italian, and what was also of course the Piedmont, the principality with Torino as their capital, of course. So those three principalities, a little bit of action also, as you see in the northern Italy. But main theater of war was the theater of war stretching from Belgium down to southwards to Bavaria, of course. Bavaria had to be saved quickly if were to play any significant factor in the war, because it was so close to the Austrian jaws. Okay, so what the French did was putting in 1701 their armies, and the Louis also has supported openly the James the Third of the dynasty of Stuart, the dynasty that was banned from England, and in the main line, only a secondary line, which was a Protestant, a couple of Protestant, two Protestant girls actually. They were okay, so they stayed in London, but the main branch of the family was banned. So, and Louis openly, for the first time, openly supported their claim to British throne. In the same time, put his armies to northern Italy, to Bavaria, in the way to Bavaria on the Rhine, and towards Bavaria, in Belgium and in Spain in the same time. So, and he even claimed openly that il n'y a plus de Pyrénées. There is no Pyrenees mountains anymore, right? So il n'y a plus de Pyrénées. Very audacious claim. And it was, of course, understandable and obvious that all Europe will try to stop him. The main military power to stop Louis XIV was the Dutch army, which is sometimes missed, which is sometimes not seen as clearly by historians even, because the Dutch army was divided. The majority of it was put on the northern theater, the Belgian Rhine, from Belgium to the Rhine territory, and this theater of war, and this war theater, and the smaller part was put on the defense of Bavaria. But some Dutch were also very much visible in the military actions in Spain, and even sometimes more numerous than British troops. So it was the Dutch power that really stopped the French. It was sometimes the like almost 50% of all Allied soldiers. Well, not counting the smaller powers like, as I said, the Piedmont and the other, for instance, Brandenburg, Prussia, because the The Prussians have acted a little bit on favor of the emperor, Leopold Habsburg, and supported him in northern Italy. And for that, they have received the noble title of the King of Prussia, and they were kingdom from now on. So this is a very important factor, because sometimes the Polish people think that the Kingdom of Prussia started from some totally different period of time in 17th century. No, it was something different. It was not yet a kingdom. Okay, so we can see that the Dutch were numerous. The Staatsleger was the biggest allied force and the second in Europe, even if we include the Russians. Is the second army in Europe. Only, of course, the Turks have more troops, but it was a completely different type of army. But the second army, and what we see in this war is basically losing strength by both the French and the Dutch in the whole course of war. And after this course of war, the France and Holland were no longer as strong as before. This is interesting. And for the French, for the Spaniards, although they suffer all the cruelties of a civil war, they've got a pretty industrious prince in form of Philip V, who was the grandson of Louis XIV of France, and he was reforming Spain pretty accurately, and with the not only moderate success, sometimes with great success. So he introduced the far superior French administrative techniques, far better than the Austrian. Austria back then was rather a disorganized country, different provinces glued together in a very poor fashion, and they were economically dependent sometimes on the Dutch and the English, because they have problems with collecting taxes even. So Austria was not such a powerful country as we can imagine, maybe. So we can really say that the Dutch were the strongest, possibly the strongest ally. Then the English, and in course of the war, the English came on the first position because the Dutch were making more of the heavy lifting. But it's not that simple. It's a little bit of of course, of a simplification. So what we have in this war exactly is that we start this war. As the war starts, we have the common monarch for both the English and the Dutch, which is William III. He has the number 3 also in the Netherlands. So is also this is a very odd situation in which you have the same number in both countries. For instance, it was a typical situation is, for instance, when you have James I in England, but he's James V in Scotland, right? So yeah, that's the typical situation. Here you have a third in Holland, third in England. So okay, and he was directing the Anglo-Dutch affairs only to his death, when he has fallen from the horse and died because of the injuries in 1702. And okay, so in France you have of course the aging Louis XIV, who is waiting for his last big war that will settle everything. And in his old enemy in Vienna, the Emperor Leopold Habsburg. And he will be with this war only to 1705. So, so you have that. So the French introduced the armies into Spain, to Bavaria, to the Rhine, to Belgium, and they are successful in the first stage of the war. There is a big problem for all the allies to keep pace with the French. And all changes in 1704 when you have a very big battle of Blenheim, as the English say Blenheim, but it's really Blenheim in Bavaria. And it all changes. Sorry, I have to drink some water. My throat is sore. Yeah, I wonder if I can just pause it, and probably I can, and stream. I don't know if it will. No, it's not really. Okay. That's very funny because it's there is a end now button, and it looks like pause, but it's not really pause. So very good, very stupid program. Okay, so but drank some water, so it's okay. So in 1704 there is a situation that the Bavarian offensive, French Bavarian offensive, stops because they lose. They lost a battle of Blenheim, which is called by the French the second battle of Hochstedt. Before it was a smaller battle of Hochstedt, but it was won by the French. But it was not such an important battle. The second battle of Hochstedt was a very grand battle indeed, and it was lost by the French. So that's that, and the British know it as a Battle of Blenheim because that's their way of pronouncing Blenheim. And they had their backs to Blenheim more than to Hochstedt, so that's why it was such a great battle that we cannot even specify which was really the name of the battle, how it should be named. So we hear so the John Churchill, who was the commander-in-chief of the British, who was also second and helped by another spectacular military figure and commander. For instance, the Dutch, they had the biggest army, but they didn't, in that particular era, they didn't have such a great warriors. So, I mean, generals and so on. They only had their inspectors, and they were posing very complicated questions and making John Churchill angry. John Churchill was in a straight line the ancestor of Winston Churchill, of course, and he has become the Duke of Marlborough, of course, and he won this war because he was doing something similar to what Napoleon was doing during Waterloo, but with much better effect. He was putting some soldiers into the city in between, and then when the enemy forces were concentrating on it, then the reserve, the biggest reserve, were crushing from two sides the engaged troops, which were not prepared for it. So that's why. So it was like a scissors, a small bite in the middle and two scissors. And because John Churchill was fighting every time different French general, then the French were not able to prepare for it and tell the tale and realize what was really happening. So Churchill was successful doing precisely the same thing for a couple of times. So the French lost the Battle of Blenheim. Bavaria was occupied by the Austrians and lost for the French as an ally. So the French were practically lost and practically alone. Sorry, and just at the moment when they have equipped the Spaniards to make some sort of force, but they were only of the local use in Spain, so not really helpful in the general way. So we have now only really two theaters, because in Italy the things were also not looking great for the French. So the French were just fighting with some success only in Belgium and in Spain from that moment on. So in 1704, it was a very bad year for the French. And okay, so now we have a different situation. We have a situation when the French are trying to do something in Spain. We have a situation when they try to stop the Allies pushing towards Belgium. And in 17 something happened in 1705, but I do not remember what really happened. It was important, but I don't remember what it was. Okay, maybe I will remind myself later. In 1706, there was a battle of Ramillies, and 2 years later, Oudenarde, and it meant that Belgium was completely lost for the French, and the French were forced to fight for their own territory. By the way, the Spanish gold from South America was also not helping, because already in 1702 the Anglo-Dutch fleet have sunk the silver or the golden, I don't remember, the something with money from the South America. This fleet was sunk, and there was no real communication between the Nueva Granada and the viceroyalty of Peru. That is the colonies in South America, the Spanish colonies, and Spain, and the Spain proper. So in Spain there was the only way the French could strengthen their forces was through the Pyrenees, of course. And even in Catalonia, in Portugal and in Catalonia, the Allies, that is the Dutch, the English, and the Austrians, were fighting and staying in defiance and so on. So what really changed in? I don't remember what happened in 75. Okay, so Bavaria was lost, but one more word about Bavaria. Bavaria, which was lost in 1704 and occupied by the Austrians for that moment on, revolted, was not occupied for the whole course of the war, revolted, and also because they've claimed that it's besser bayerisch sterben als kaiserlich leben. It's better to live as Bavarians than to die as Bavarians and then to live as Austrians. So as imperials, so that as Austrians. So they were revolting. So. By the way, in the same time, there was a revolt organized by the French in Hungary. So there was also some sub-theater of that war. Okay, so what's yet? And okay, so in there was a small moment in which the Great Northern War was almost connected with the War of the Spanish Succession. We must remember here in Central and Eastern Europe. I am talking here from Poland. I am a Polish historian, so it's very much the War of the Spanish Succession is very much forgotten because it was fought in the exact same time as the Great Northern War, and which is funny because not only those two wars connected for a small while, but they also word of Spanish succession when we mention how many troops were fighting it and so on. It was like 3 times bigger. The armies were bigger than the Russian and Swedish armies and so on. And the whole, but still in 1706, when the Swedish king Charles XII was chasing the deposed Saxon king of Poland to his mother country of Saxony, and he has forced him to sign the humiliating Treaty of Altenstedt. There was also a possibility that the Swedish king will will mix himself into the Western European affairs, and maybe even decide the fate of the war by joining with his 40,000 of men, which was something still, even when we know that the British had like 2 times as much, and the same with the Austrians and the Dutch, even more than twice. But still, it could be the deciding factor. The Swedish army was good, so both the French, they have sent, I think, the Marshal Charles de Villars, I think. Maybe it was some other general, I don't remember. And the English have sent Marlborough to talk to Charles XII. And Charles didn't really mix into the Western European affairs. He only used his extraordinary temporary position to press the emperor to give back the religious tolerance and to the Silesian Germans. Silesia was back then within the borders of the Austrian Empire, so the emperors did everything what the Swedish king asked. And out of gratitude, many Silesian Germans joined the Swedish army marching towards Russia, by the way. But it was the last time when the Eastern War has influenced the Western War. Okay, so by the way, the War of the Spanish Succession was also very European. It didn't have this vast colonial element as the 7 Years' War, for instance, in a couple of decades will have. The skirmishes in India and Canada were very small and so insignificant. And the whole war was decided in 1711. When the Emperor of Austria, already were 2 emperors forward, because the Emperor Leopold have died in 1705. That was the important factor that happened in 1705, because the young, vibrant new emperor Joseph I, who was very gracious and pretty, and because of that, it was said, sometimes it's said, that his younger brother Charles, who was fighting against the French in Spain, was jealous of him and maybe even poisoned him. But the Austrian historians are always denying it, because they have, although they are very, very strong republicans, usually, and no monarchies by any stretch of the imagination, then usually they do not tolerate very, very well when somebody is denigrating the Habsburgs, even when they should be denigrated a little bit. So we have, from 1705, we have different emperor, the Joseph the First, who is very vibrant. He has some military experience, and he is changing the odds for the Austrians, and he is putting some new energy to the war, and that's why the Ramillies, 1706, the great catastrophe for the French, and then Oudenarde, the another way, and then Belgium is lost for the French, and in 1709, the French are already forced to fight for their own mother country territory of France, in Picardy and in Champagne. And so, but in 1709, there is a very big and very bloody, the bloodiest battle probably of the big battles, to be sure, among the big battles, even worse than the Battle of Gross-Jägerdorf during the war of the King of Prussia, of Frederick II. So 7 years War, to be exact, to be precise. So this very bloody Battle of Malplaquet, fought in 1709. It was very significant because the French were not only they did not only have to fight for their own territory, first time in decades, but they also had to use some sort of summoned peasants in form of temporary soldiers in order to have really some troops to be able to stop the invasion of France, which was it was very close to Paris and Versailles already, and they did precisely that. And the country which has invented the standing professional army had to rely upon the people who were summoned for a small, just for the defense. It's a very very bloody battle. The French generally lost it, but also put some cost some such heavy losses on the Anglo-Austrian, Anglo-Dutch-Austrian invasion forces that they had to stop this march towards Paris. And the winter of 1709 was such, it was even nicknamed Grand Hiver, the Big Frost. It was such a bigger problem for the whole of Europe. Many civilians died, and many villages depopulated. It was such a huge problem that that the energy of war was really ended, and in 1710, when the Allied forces made the last big efforts to have Spain for the Habsburgs. In 1911, there was then odds changed for the French for the first time from Blenheim, really, because in 1711, the vibrant Emperor Joseph I died, probably, possibly poisoned by his brother, but it would be very stupid because from that moment on, the Dutch and the English had no motivation to help Vienna anymore, because it was understandable and obvious that if the Habsburgs succeed in this war, then all the land of the Austrian Habsburgs and the Spanish Habsburgs from the past will be combined as one force. So that would mean that Brussels, Milan, Vienna, Prague, Lima, Mexico, and so on, Barcelona, it's all under one ruler, and what was unacceptable. The Dutch and the English didn't say anything out loud. They were already losing the energy for the war, the motivation for the war, really, from 1710, because the Whig No Peace Without Spain party was displaced and was switched by the Tory party with such notable ministers like Harley and Bolingbroke, and they have decided that they will be trying to reach peace agreement. So, and in 1711, when it was already understood that the Austrians are on their way to the dominance, almost exactly as the French were before they were crushed at Rabier and Oudenarde and so on, then the I have read the diplomatic correspondence of Anthony Heinsius. Heinsius was a grootpensionaris from Holland. That means the highest ranking official of the most powerful province of all the Republic Republiek van de Zeven Provinciën van Nederland. And Holland was like 40% of population and even more than 50% of money in Holland back then. So and Holland was united, not like two provinces, Zuid-Holland and North Holland, like today. So they were totally controlling what was happening really in Holland. And Anthony Heinsius, who was, and I was reading his diplomatic correspondence when I was working on the biography of Simon van Slingeland, who was starting to be a very serious politician back then, and then and the reformer of the reformer of the country after the war, when Holland was still suffering from the efforts made during the war. Okay, so Heinsius was very plainly stating that they should be more pretending to be fighting on, and the same were the British doing. So Austria was really fighting from 1711 on their own against the whole might of, well, not as big, not as strong might as before, but still against the whole might of France. So, but still they put the fight, but still it was too late, and they didn't have enough power to keep everything for the Habsburgs. So the Dutch and the English, even the Dutch and the English were even the Dutch and the English were even they even made a separate peace with the French at Utrecht in 1713, and then Austria was already officially fighting on its own, or her own, Austria on her own. Okay, so and was still only 1 year of fighting took place, and then the Austrians and the French met at Rastatt in the German Principality of Baden, and they've signed a treaty that would end the war, which is some things about this war are very funny, because when we look at, for instance, then Great Northern War, well, the Swedes have suffered a big calamity at Poltava, right? And it was the beginning of an end, and they never regained power as they had at their disposal before. So we have a precise moment, which is funny, because we can see exactly something similar in also 1709, Malplaquet and the crushing of the French power, but it was not as decisive as the defeat of Poltava at Poltava. So it seems that, unlike the Great Northern War, the War of the Spanish Succession did not possess any moment any natural conclusion. What really happened was what really stopped the war, stopped the fighting, was because it was much more evened out than the Great Northern War after 1709. And what really stopped the war was, well, the death of Joseph I, the Emperor of Austria, from 1705 to 1711. So that was what stopped the war. It's very unnatural way of the war being concluded. So yeah, so it's a very unusual conflict, the War of the Spanish Succession. It was a huge war. It was the biggest war in Europe from the ancient times, a huge war in the Western Europe. It was like 3 times more bloody and powerful, and in the terms of the number of troops, soldiers, and so on, than the Great Northern War, and it means something, right? The war that is 3 times bigger than the war that has great in its name. So yeah, as I said before, when you asked me to say something about the War of the Spanish Succession, it's like it's a very vast topic, and I am not sure if I even touched all the interesting aspects, but maybe I can tell very quickly about what happened in every of these of those countries involved in the war after the war. So Bavaria was occupied for the Austrians and revolted, so it was pretty feeble after the war. And the role of Bavaria was never to be so big as up to this moment. The same with Holland. All they were still very successful in business, but not so much in war and international politics anymore after the war. There were some, as mentioned, there was some uh, administrative atomization, so to speak, and there were no real modern type um, ministers ministries, like French type departments or English type departments, just some representative bodies that were mostly fighting against each other, and with politicians mostly fighting against each other. What Simon de Slingeland proposed to make some sort of a centralization, but it was refused. So yeah, so he was like a Cassandra, and he even described him in that way, as he's a Dutch Cassandra. And it turned out that he was right, and that's sad, but it was too late. So the English were already victorious in all the business possibilities, and the Dutch were going down, and England was going more and more on a successful path. Okay, so England have gained not so much as she could gain from this war, because of the switching of parties during the war. If the Whigs were in control in the moment when the war concluded, then the British probably would gain some more interesting things from this war. And they had very interesting business prospects and privileges in the South America. They gained this so-called asiento. They also and they say secured the situation in their more or less in their will, according to their willing. But it's not such a striking victory, which is also very puzzling. Is that Spain, although it was suffering all the time because of the civil war and because of the main war, also played and at her territory. But Spain was a theater for a very successful reforms of Philip V, the French prince that was governing Spain now, and so it was on the path to reconstruction. Totally different than, for instance, Poland, although Poland was suffering very similar fate, being more a theater of war than the country participating in one. But never really gained the objectivity, so to speak. And whereas Spain really gained a little bit strength, and in the 50s were already a pretty powerful state again, although they still were a little bit backwards after behind France or England. France have suffered so much that from this moment on, it was not obvious anymore that the French standing army would be the strongest and the most numerous. From that moment on, it happened sometimes in some decades that the imperial Austrian army could be a little bit more numerous. I'm not counting the Turks, because the army was something completely different, far less rigorously trained, far less, far worse equipped, and something different. So it was, of course, very big, but still. So from this moment on, of course, and it was many decades before the Russian army started to be the biggest army in Europe. So it was already under Catherine the Great was happening. That was happening. So, but in 1730s, for instance, and 1740s, in 1740s, the French have somehow managed to make the budget working again. Until the 7 Years' War happened, and the French were losing their economical ground again. There were many different problems with the lack of central banking system, for instance, and different, which even in Spain there was a central bank from some moment, some point, and in France never before the revolution. So France was doing well, secured its prince on the Spanish throne, but still it was not such a big deal as they probably thought that it would be more worthwhile, and it wasn't. So the Belgium and Milan went to the Habsburgs, of course, and the South American Spanish colonies to Spain and to France, really. So balance of power, the équilibre, was saved. But still, it's a very very puzzling war, because this is not a war that ended with some spectacular catastrophe, some spectacular military failure or victory. It was more a war that was very even, very fought on the even level from both sides, and really, for the most part of the war, from the most of the years, and it basically ended because of political, not military reasons. So it was ended by diplomacy, not ended by military. Ended by death of Joseph I, primarily. So very unusual conflict, and yeah. So it's never. I think it's never enough to speaking about this particular conflict, because it's so unusual, and it's also the biggest military conflict when we consider the number of forces, of troops, and so on, and the cost and so on. We can only compare it with, I don't know, Octavian August or Caesar, or we cannot even compare to anything before in the Western Europe. So it's a very fascinating conflict, and in Poland it's practically unknown, because of the Great Northern War happening in almost exactly the same time, and almost exactly throughout the same years. Okay, so that's that. I hope it was interesting, and I will refresh myself and maybe make the German version. Why not? Yeah.